All right, today we are cracking open one of the most influential and honestly most controversial military documents of the 21st century, Field Manual 3-24. Now, this is not your typical guide to warfare. You won't find tank battles or dogfights in here. No, this is the playbook for a much, much murkier kind of conflict. A war that isn't fought for territory, but for the trust and loyalty of the people. It's about a war of ideas, of influence, and ultimately of popular support. So, what's the big idea here? At its absolute core, the doctrine laid out in this manual argues that an insurgency isn't primarily a military conflict at all. It's a political contest. It is a battle for legitimacy in the eyes of the population. Everything, and I mean every single action, flows from this one central idea. And this really frames the fundamental problem this manual was written to solve. I mean, think about it. How does a state with a formal army, a treasury, all the levers of power, how does it lose the consent of its own people? And once that trust is shattered, what does it actually take to earn it back? This is the central challenge of what the military calls counterinsurgency, or COIN. Let's look at the official definition for a second. You gotta pay attention to the key words here: subversion and violence. Those are just the tools. The real goal is political control. Insurgents don't just use violence randomly. It's a very calculated performance, a means to a political end. The goal is to prove the government is illegitimate and that they, the insurgents, are the better, more just alternative. And here it is, folks. This is the thesis statement for the entire doctrine, boiled down to 5 simple words. Legitimacy is the main objective. This completely flips conventional military thinking on its head. The goal isn't to destroy the enemy force, it's to convince the population that the government is the rightful, competent, and just authority. Winning their trust is way more important than winning firefights. Okay, let's use an analogy to make this super clear. Imagine the government is an established, maybe even an old and tired legacy brand. The insurgents, they're the aggressive, disruptive startup, and they're both competing for the loyalty of the exact same customer base, the people. The winner isn't necessarily the one with the biggest advertising budget or the most factories. It's the one who convinces the customers that their product, their vision for the future, is the better one. So if the whole game is about winning over that customer base, how does a disruptive startup like an insurgency even get off the ground? What are the conditions that allow this kind of conflict to ignite in the first place? Well, the manual breaks it down into a pretty clear formula, which you can almost think of it as a recipe for conflict. And this recipe has 3 essential ingredients. You have to have all 3 for an insurgency to really take root and succeed: opportunity, motive, and means. If you're missing even one of these, the whole movement is probably going to fizzle out before it ever truly begins. All right, let's break that recipe down. First step, opportunity. This is the power vacuum. When a government is just too weak, too corrupt, or too incompetent to provide basic things like security, justice, or services, it creates a space for someone else to step in and do it. Then you need motive, and this is the powerful story. Insurgents are masters of narrative. They take real or perceived grievances, corruption, persecution, no jobs, and they weave them into this compelling story that clearly identifies a villain and offers a simple, powerful solution. And finally, you need the means. This is the tangible stuff: the people willing to fight, the weapons to arm them, the money to pay them, and the logistical network to supply them, whether that comes from local supporters, criminal rackets, or even foreign sponsors. Now, it's really important to distinguish insurgency from these other terms because they get thrown around a lot. A rebellion might be a violent uprising, but it often lacks that sophisticated political program that an insurgency has. A revolution is basically a massive, super popular insurgency that wants to tear down and rebuild the entire system. And a coup d'etat? That's an inside job. It's a swift power grab, usually by the military or some other internal faction. An insurgency is different. It's that slow, grinding, long-term struggle to win political control by chipping away at the government's legitimacy, piece by piece, until it just collapses. Okay, so now that we get the anatomy of an insurgency, how in the world do you fight one? This brings us to counterinsurgency. And this is where the doctrine gets truly radical, especially for a military that, back in the early 2000s, was built on the idea of just overwhelming force. COIN is a philosophy that's built on a series of paradoxes that seem to defy conventional military logic. But before we get to those paradoxes, you have to understand this one crucial thing. COIN is not just a military job. It is a comprehensive, whole-of-government effort. It needs diplomats, agricultural experts, engineers, lawyers, all working together with soldiers. The goal isn't just to kill the enemy, it's to help the host nation build up its own ability and legitimacy so it can govern effectively. Here's the first paradox, and man, does it fly in the face of this shock and awe mentality. In a normal war, firepower is king. In coin, an over-reliance on force can be absolutely catastrophic. Every mistaken airstrike, every civilian casualty, every door kicked in at 3 a.m. creates a new grievance, it pushes the population away, and it becomes a powerful recruiting poster for the insurgents. You might win that little skirmish, but in doing so, you create 10 new enemies and start to lose the much bigger war for legitimacy. And this one brilliantly illustrates the second paradox. I mean, what's a more powerful weapon in this kind of fight? A Hellfire missile? Or a new well that provides clean water to a village for the very first time? A rifle? Or a judge who can fairly solve a land dispute that's been tearing a community apart? This manual argues that things like economic development, good governance, and political participation are often way more decisive in winning over the people than just pure military might. This last one. This might be the hardest pill for a military culture built on action to swallow. Insurgents will often conduct attacks specifically to provoke an overreaction. They want the counterinsurgent force to lock down a whole neighborhood or conduct indiscriminate raids, because then they can use that heavy-handed response as propaganda to prove their narrative that the government and its partners are just brutal oppressors. Sometimes the most disciplined, most strategically brilliant move is to show restraint and just not take the bait. This question really crystallizes the entire philosophy. In this kind of conflict, what's the ultimate weapon? Is it the one that eliminates an enemy or the one that builds a citizen? The coin doctrine argues that in the long run, that school and all the hope and opportunity it represents is infinitely more powerful. So if coin is this really complex blend of politics, economics, and security, what does it actually look like on the ground? Well, the manual outlines two broad strategic approaches for putting these paradoxical principles into practice. On one side, you've got the direct approach. This is the more traditional military role, right? It's focused on finding and defeating the armed insurgent fighters. But on the other, and often more critical side, you have the indirect approach. This is all about working by, with, and through the host nation's own forces and institutions. The goal here isn't for foreign troops to win the war, but to empower the host nation to become capable and legitimate enough to win it for themselves. A classic playbook for that direct approach is shape, clear, hold, build, transition. First, you shape the environment, gathering intel, isolating the insurgents. Then you clear the area of active enemy fighters. And this is the absolute key to the whole model, you can't just leave. You have to hold the area. We saw this in Al-Qaeda, Iraq, where U.S. Marines didn't just clear towns, they immediately built 14 small combat outposts inside those communities, living among the people to provide security 24/7. And it's only inside that new bubble of security that you can build, restoring electricity, opening clinics, helping local government get back on its feet. The final step is always to transition that responsibility back to the host nation's own forces. And all of this brings us right back to our central theme. If the fight is for legitimacy, what does winning actually look like? It's not a surrender ceremony on a battleship. It's something much more subtle and a lot harder to measure. The manual is emphatic on this point, directly calling out the failures of the past. In Vietnam, for example, enemy body counts were used as the main metric for success, a practice that turned out to be tragically misleading. True victory in coin is only achieved when the host nation has developed the capacity to secure its own people and govern legitimately, without needing indefinite outside support. This quote just perfectly captures the entire philosophy. Once a basic level of security is in place, the real lasting victory isn't won on the battlefield, it's won in the marketplace and in the voting booth. Dollars and ballots ultimately have a more important and lasting impact than bombs and bullets, because they build a society that people believe is actually worth defending. So in the end, the goal isn't a military parade to celebrate a defeated enemy. It's the quiet, undramatic sight of a government that the people actually trust, a government that can finally provide for and secure itself. That is the only victory that lasts. Which leaves us with one final provocative question to think about. In an age of these complex, population-centric conflicts where the fight is over ideas and loyalties, maybe the most powerful weapon system we can help build isn't a new fighter jet or an aircraft carrier, but a stable, legitimate, and effective government.